Hello, everybody, wherever you're joining us from around the world. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Thank you for joining us here at Honest Reporting. It was an exciting day in Israel. A lot of action. We want to let you know about all of it. So just stick with us for a few seconds, and we're going to get started. And we welcome all of you from wherever you are here at Honest Reporting. It was an amazing day at the Supreme Court. Let me just explain some of the background. And by the way, as I go along, please ask your questions in the comments, and I'll make sure as soon as we finish to answer them. If you remember, just a little while ago, a few weeks ago, I gave this amazing announcement. We have a unity government in Israel. We're not going to go to a fourth election. We have this Netanyahu and Benny Gantz have come together for a wide-ranging unity government, and all seemed like it was just moving towards that direction. Here's the part that many people don't realize. In order to put this unity government together, it was not a simple task at all. Remember, we had election campaign after election campaign where Netanyahu was slinging mud towards Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz was slinging mud back towards Netanyahu. Both were basically saying the other one is unfit to serve as prime minister. And now they're going to sit together. So there were many nuances that had to be worked out in order to put this unity government into place and to establish a rotation between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. Let me just explain. The unity agreement says that for the first 18 months, Netanyahu is going to be the prime minister and Benny Gantz is going to be the vice prime minister. After 18 months, they're going to switch. They're going to rotate. Benny Gantz becomes the prime minister and Netanyahu becomes the vice prime minister. Just in order to make that happen, basic laws in Israel had to be changed. For example, there is no position called vice prime minister. So they have to establish into law, to a basic law of the government, a new position called vice prime minister. And they want to put into place that vice prime minister has the standing legally of a prime minister. Why is that significant? Because Israel has a prime minister right now, Netanyahu, who is under indictment. His trial is going to be starting, seems, in a few weeks. And the law allows a prime minister to serve while under indictment. The left wing and right wing years ago came together and said, we don't want to have a prosecutor who comes along and doesn't like a prime minister for political reasons and indicts him to bring down a government. So a prime minister stays, even if they're under indictment. But how can Netanyahu become a vice prime minister if he's under indictment? Israeli law does not allow one to serve as a minister while under indictment. So they're giving the vice prime minister the standing of a prime minister. He can serve even while under indictment. That requires changes in legislation to make that happen. There are other changes that have to be done. For example, Benny Gantz is very suspect of Netanyahu. There's a lack of trust between the sides. What will happen if, as it comes close to the 18 months, Netanyahu pulls the Likud with its 36 seats out of the coalition, he collapses the government, and Benny Gantz has not had a chance to become prime minister. So they're establishing into law that if that would happen, Benny Gantz automatically becomes prime minister for 6 months, and then elections are held 3 months after that, basically guaranteeing him that he could be the prime minister for 9 months. Change in legislation. In fact, they're going so far as to say that when Netanyahu is sworn as the first prime minister in the rotation, Gantz at that moment will be sworn in as the prime minister for 18 months from now, or for whenever the rotation happens, just to secure that he automatically becomes the prime minister. These are all changes in basic laws that need to take place in order for this rotation government to take off. So the Knesset has been very busy trying to fast track the system to get these laws passed. And the opposition has, they've entered thousands of reservations to try to push off the process. Why is pushing off the process going to help? We have to remember that the Knesset is currently under a deadline. There were 21 days that were given to the Knesset for someone to come forward with 61 supporters to form a government, or else Israel goes to a fourth election. May 7th is that deadline, this coming Thursday night at 12 a.m. So the coalition agreement must be in place, and there must be 61 supporters of Netanyahu. Gantz and Netanyahu must close all of these gaps and have this legislation passed in order to be able to present to the president. Netanyahu is going to be the next prime minister for 18 months, and then Gantz, and we protect ourselves and prevent ourselves from going to a fourth election. There are other laws that have to be passed in order for this government to work. They don't have to be passed, but Blue and White very much wants to pass them. Very complicated, intricate procedures in terms of freeing up some of their members of Knesset to be ministers and to allow people further back on the list to come in. I don't want to get into the details of this right now, but all of these laws are questionable. And there are petitioners who went to the Supreme Court, both opposition parties, political parties, and other non-governmental organizations, and they said, we want the Supreme Court to get involved and invalidate what's going on over here. These laws are changing the way things have been done in Israel. We don't accept this. And they also challenge the coalition agreement itself, because there are problems in the coalition agreement. For example, the Knesset bylaws require a new government, a new coalition, to have what's called in Hebrew kavei yesod, basic foundations. What are the goals? What are the values? What are the principles of this new government? This coalition agreement doesn't have them. Gantz and Netanyahu are not at a point right now to agree on what those basic principles should be. So the coalition agreement says there's going to be a 6-month emergency government. We're dealing with Corona right now, the health ramifications, the economic ramifications. This government is not going to have its governing principles and values. We're focused on Corona. And during the 6 months, we'll work out what the principles and values will be beyond that. That's a change from the way things are supposed to be done. They said that during those first 6 months, no laws can be passed that don't have to do with Corona, parenthetically, with the exception of possibly applying sovereignty to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria come July 1st. But otherwise, no major legislation. We're putting the Knesset essentially on hold. That's a change. Putting the Knesset on hold and not having legislation being passed. They also did not allow the opposition to have leadership of any committees in the new government coalition, in the new Knesset. And they also did not allow any opposition members to be on the committee to appoint judges. That the opposition and these other organizations are saying, this is not good. This has to be invalidated. They said during the first 6 months, there can be no appointments, major appointments made. So for example, Israel right now does not have a chief of police, and the new government, the new Knesset, has to appoint one. They said, we're not going to do that right now. We're going to push that off till after the 6 months, changing the way things have been done. Now, there are two sides to the equation. Gantz and Netanyahu say, we're in an emergency situation. We've had 3 election cycles. We don't want to go to a fourth. It's very difficult to bridge the gaps between the two sides. We're running against the clock. Let's just have this coalition agreement put together, even though we've changed certain things from the way they've been done, and we'll work it out as time goes along. And the opposition says, no, we don't want that to happen. And they go to the Supreme Court to be able to deal with it. Now, this is an amazing process because remember, Israel is 72 years old. We're still in our baby steps in terms of world history, and we're working out all of our policies. And the decisions that this court is going to be making about these issues can have long-term impact on future governments and future coalitions, and really also trying to understand the relationship between the courts and the Knesset. Remember, the parliament is the will of the people. That's the people elected 120 members of Knesset, and they're the ones who are making these decisions. Does the court have the right to step in or not? When does the court have the right to step in or not? And this is an issue which has been going on in Israel for years and is very much coming to a head today. And the other major issue, and I'm so curious in the comments, you can write what you think that this hearing is dealing with, is can Netanyahu be tasked with forming a government to begin with while under indictment? I mentioned before that Israeli law allows a prime minister to continue serving even if he's indicted. We don't want to have a prosecutor come along and say, I don't like this prime minister, I'll indict him. But can the prime minister form a new government while under indictment? It's unclear. And therefore, the petitioners are saying Netanyahu cannot become the new prime minister of a new government while under indictment. The other side says, well, why not? He was voted up. The people voted for Likud. There's a majority that wants him to be prime minister. That's the will of the people. There's no law that says he's not allowed to do so. So curious to hear what all of you think about that issue in the comments, but that's something which was brought before the courts as well. So this sets the stage for these last 2 days of marathon hearings in the Supreme Court. And in an amazing step, the hearings were broadcast live on TV, on the web, and full transparency to see the proceedings. And I have to tell you, it was incredible. It was incredible to see it and to witness the attorneys for all the sides presenting, the justices asking their questions, and the Chief Justice gave the maximum number of 11. There are 15 Supreme Court justices in Israel. She assigned 11 to be on the bench to rule in this case. A wide range from liberal to conservative, males and females, Jewish and non-Jewish, real democracy in action. As we saw this full bench of 11 justices sitting there. And yesterday was dedicated to, should Netanyahu be allowed to be the new prime minister while under indictment? That was the big question which yesterday's hearing dealt with. There are 4 conservative justices who it's pretty clear that they don't want to see judicial overreach, and they don't want to see the Knesset's deciding right now, and there are 61 MKs who want Netanyahu, and it's the will of the people, and they don't want to see the court interfering. And amazingly, during the day, it became pretty clear that both the Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, and the Deputy Chief Justice, Hanan Meltzer, they very much seem to be on the side of there's a will of the people. And there's no law that says otherwise. And why would we as a court get involved in that? So if I was a betting man, I would say that the court is not going to interfere, and they will allow Netanyahu to be the prime minister in the first part of this rotation in this government with Gantz. But it was a full day of every side given the chance to present it. And the court gave the petitioner's attorneys a chance to show where does it say that this is illegal. We're a court. We don't get involved in what people want or don't want. It's a question of the law. And there doesn't seem to be any law indicating either way. So that's what yesterday's hearings were about. Today got into the nitty-gritty of the coalition agreement. And here again, we saw an amazing process as the judges said, we don't have the ability to interfere with a political agreement. That happens within the Knesset. There might be things that some of us don't like, and there might be things which the petitioners think aren't good. But in one really amazing moment, Justice Amit said, you're asking us to issue a court order that the world should be a better place. And we as judges don't have the power to do that. We are ruling about if things go against the basic laws that have existed in Israel. And therefore, throughout the day, they basically said all the laws that I told you about before, about the new law for the vice prime minister serving while under indictment, changing the way it works in terms of the rotation. They said if a law is passed, then at that point, you can petition to the court and we can analyze it. But right now, it's just on paper in a coalition agreement, and they're not getting involved at all in those laws. They did turn to the attorney for Gantz and Netanyahu, and they said, it's not right that you do not have those kaveh yesod, those basic foundations in your coalition agreement. The Knesset bylaws require that, and basically indicating that that could be a basis to invalidate the agreement because it's going against set Knesset rules. And the attorneys immediately said, we're gonna deal with that. Those will be written. The attorneys seem to also agree that they will get rid of the clauses about no legislation during the first 6 months, no appointments during the 6 months, because those were the issues that the justices seem to have with the agreement itself. So it seems, as far as we can tell, that there's not going to be any kind of intervention right now, especially assuming that those changes are made with the coalition agreement. I will tell you that the Knesset itself today came to agreement regarding the timeline, and all those new laws that need to be passed for the coalition agreement to move forward are going to be done. They're going to be finished and voted on in the Knesset by Thursday morning. You talk about right before the deadline. On Thursday morning, those will be voted on, and then the prime minister will be able to go to the president and say, here, I have 61 signatures, I'm going to form the government. Now, remember before I mentioned that the court won't intervene while law hasn't been passed, but once the laws are passed, won't there be petitions made to the Supreme Court that these laws are not allowed? And here is my scoop for all of you. It's an unbelievable scoop. I spoke to a constitutional scholar in Israel, someone who understands all of the inner workings of all of this. And he told me that the reason they're passing these laws as what's called Chukei Yesod, basic laws, constitutional laws, which are not a basic majority, it's a larger majority. It's going to be at least 70. They will need at least 70 to overturn them. And the Supreme Court does not historically and traditionally get involved in laws that are passed as basic laws. So even though today the court said we can't intervene with these laws because they haven't been passed yet, throughout the day they kept saying, why are you passing them as basic laws? Why don't you just make them like temporary measures? The answer is because once they are passed as basic laws, there is no precedent for the court to get involved and invalidate a basic law. And therefore, at the end of this whole process and this whole sequence, what I think you're going to see is the laws will pass. There will be petitions made to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will say they were passed as basic laws. We don't intervene with those. Netanyahu will be able to present the 61 signatures, it'll be more than that, to the president. And sometime next week, we should see the new government in Israel being sworn in. A lot of people in Israel are against the government. They feel that it's too bloated, it's too large. How can Gantz be with Netanyahu? How can Netanyahu be with Gantz? By the way, the Yamina party, right-wing party that has always been supportive of Netanyahu, as far as we can tell right now, they will not be part of that coalition. There'll be a right-wing opposition to Netanyahu. But regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, it seems like it's all heading towards the end of this process with a new wide-ranging 70-plus seat government sometime next week. Just me personally now, I think it's a good thing for Israel. We need to deal with the corona crisis, and Israel's in need of healing. And the wider the government is, the better. And we'll see how it all works out. But one thing is for sure, democracy is alive and well in Israel. You have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch under formation, you have the courts doing a very fair, balanced, open, transparent process, and all of that will lead to checks and balances over what's happening. But at the end of the day, a government forming in Israel. I should also mention to you, just parenthetically, throughout the last few weeks, there have been demonstrations in Israel, again, as people exercise their democratic right to protest. And even though we were under lockdown because of Corona, they made a special exception for demonstrations because no one wanted to accuse the government of shutting down free speech and the right to protest. There were demonstrations outside the Knesset and public squares, outside the courts. They were supposed to keep to rules of social distancing. But this is all Israeli democracy alive and well. And if you look back over 15 months of a political stalemate and some political chaos, you know what? The people have not been hitting the streets. No violence, nothing militant. We're a country of rules, of laws, and a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. I hope this has explained to you some of what has happened over the last few days in the Supreme Court. Please feel free to ask your questions below in the comments. I'll spend some time now and I'll make sure to answer them. And stay tuned for more updates as we hopefully make our way towards a final wide-ranging unity government and a break from elections in Israel and governing, and Israel continuing to move forward as this light of democracy in the Middle East and a light unto the nations throughout the world. Thank you so much for joining us.